Well, if you've watched this channel for any amount of time, you know that we really like to go to Civil War battle sites. We've spent a ton of time at places like Gettysburg and also Fort Donelson and Jenkins Ferry and places like that. And throughout all of that, I have people who have continually asked me, when are you going to Antietam? Well, right now I am standing next to the Potomac River, and I am on the Maryland side. And for the next several episodes, we're going to be tackling the Battle of Antietam. We have some people who are going to be jumping in who are way more knowledgeable and intelligent than I am. But before we get to Antietam, we need to kind of work our way there, which is why we are here at White's Ferry. Okay, now before we get into the Battle of Antietam, it might be a good idea to set up some context as to why we are right here at this spot right now. So in the last few days of August of 1862, Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia had pretty much spanked General Pope and the Union Army of Virginia at the Second Battle of Manassas, or as they called it in the Confederacy, the Second Battle of Bull Run. Well, after that battle, Robert E. Lee had to make a decision. He couldn't stay where he was at. They didn't have enough provisions to take care of the army right there in that area. He couldn't go east because he didn't have a strong enough force to take on Washington, D.C. He didn't really want to go south or go west because that would be giving up ground they had just won. So the decision was made that they were going to take the fight out of Virginia for the first time, cross this river right here, the Potomac, and bring the fight into Union territory in Maryland in hopes of gathering provisions and also maybe recruiting some people in this slave state that had remained loyal to the Union. As I mentioned, we are standing on the banks of the historic Potomac River. Now, I've driven over this river several times, but this is the first opportunity that I've had to actually get out and get right up to the banks. And as I mentioned, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was coming up into Maryland. This was going to be the first invasion into the north. And they would have crossed, not exactly here, but in this area around September 4th through the 6th of 1862. So where we are standing right now is at White's Ferry. And unfortunately, the ferry is closed. I was really looking forward to crossing here. But where Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crossed was actually about 2 miles upstream. That's all on private property, so we can't access it. So as I mentioned, there would have been about 35,000 troops who crossed here. And this would have been kind of a rough-looking bunch. They were dirty, they hadn't showered, a lot of them are without shoes. In some cases, their clothes are just hanging off of them. And crossing this river was going to be an opportunity to actually bathe and get clean. And one Maryland resident recalled that the veteran troops were, quote, the dirtiest, filthiest, piratical-looking cutthroat men I ever saw. Yet, there was a dash about them that the northern men lacked. You can imagine as Confederates were crossing over the Potomac, the band would have struck up a song that was quite popular called Maryland, My Maryland. So Confederate troops would have been hearing the song as they are coming over into Union territory. And they also would have crossed this old canal right here. This is called the C&O Canal, or the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. Runs parallel to the Potomac River on the Maryland side. And the Confederates were going to be making efforts to damage and destroy parts of this canal to disrupt supply and communication for the Union troops. Before we move on to the next place, I want to kind of point out something that I think people will find interesting. If you want to learn more about the Civil War, if you want to go visit some of these more obscure spots, one resource that I would certainly recommend is something called Civil War Trails. So they've marked all of these historically important spots. They have information panels there, which are very, very helpful. This one is talking about the 1862 Antietam campaign. And then this one is talking about White's Ferry, where we are right now. And then here, they show you some of the principal characters involved, Lee and McClellan. Here's an artist's depiction of the Confederates crossing the Potomac into Maryland. And then they have a map that kind of orients you as to where you are in relation to where all of these different historic events took place. So here we are at White's Ferry. White's Ford is right here. So here's the Potomac River. This is where Lee's army would have crossed and then would have made their way north, which is the way that we are going to make right now. Okay, well, I need to amend an earlier statement that I made. I said that the location of White's Ford is currently on private property. Well, I fortunately took a look at the Civil War Trails app again, and it turns out that there is a public access. So, we've driven like 45 minutes to an hour. We're on the Virginia side of White's Ford now. Even though it's just a couple miles upstream, the access isn't exactly the easiest. Or the quickest. So anyway, we've driven around here, and right here you can imagine there in early September of 1862, 35 to 40,000 men from the Army of Northern Virginia all amassed here, getting ready to cross the Potomac over into Union territory in the state of Maryland. So here is the actual crossing site of the Army of Northern Virginia at White's Ford. So we were just downstream earlier at White's Ferry, and on September 6th, around midday, well, you would have had the Army of Northern Virginia under Jackson that would have crossed right here. The next day, you would have had the wing under James Longstreet that would have crossed, followed by Jeb Stuart's cavalry, who had been doing a feint towards Washington, D.C. One interesting thing to note, not all of the Confederate soldiers who approached the banks of the Potomac over on the Virginia side crossed over into Maryland. There was a decent number of Confederates from the western counties of like North and South Carolina who basically said that they had signed up to defend the Confederacy, not to invade other areas or to invade Union territory, and they flat refused to cross. So that was a little bit of a problem. The rest of them, though, ended up crossing right here at White's Ford, and Lee would kind of be reconsolidating his army up around Frederick, which is where we're headed next. Okay, well, we have shifted north, and right now I'm just south of the city of Frederick in Maryland on the Monocacy National Battlefield. There was a battle that was fought here in 1864. We're going to revisit that at some future date. The reason that we're here now is this particular site in 1862 was known as the Best Farm, and after Robert E. Lee got his army across the Potomac River, the Army of Northern Virginia kind of reorganized and encamped right here on what at the time was a huge farm, over 700 acres. So the Best Farm was going to see a lot of activity during the Civil War. Both the Union and Confederate armies were going to pass through here several times. So if we look off there in the distance, we can see a stone barn. This wooden structure here in front of us is a corn crib that, to the best of my understanding, was not here during the Civil War. It was added in the 1870s. And then we have the main house here. Now, the Bests hadn't always lived in this area. This was originally a plantation that was owned by a French family that had moved here in the 1790s. As a matter of fact, if we look out beyond that structure there on that hillside where you can see that corn growing right now, that was originally the location of a slave village that held like upwards of 90 enslaved individuals. This French family, and I think I'm pronouncing their name right, the Vincendary family, they were French planters who had fled the slave revolt in Haiti in 1793, had moved here to Frederick County, Maryland, and were kind of reestablishing this Caribbean-style slave plantation. And there were reports that they were exceptionally cruel to their slaves. Well, they ended up selling the property, I think, in the late 1820s, and in 1862 it would have been the Best family. One other quick thing, now don't quote me on this because I could be wrong. I mentioned that I didn't think the corn crib was here during the Civil War. I'm also thinking that the portable toilet is also something that is not original to the battlefield, but I could be wrong. Okay, I've moved over a little bit to a different area of the Best farm, and the spot that I'm standing in right now, well, obviously is set up as a cornfield presently, but in September of 1862, the 6th through the 9th, this would have been the approximate area where Robert E. Lee would have had his headquarters set up. Now, Robert E. Lee knew that McClellan was coming up from the south, and he also found out right here in this area that in Harper's Ferry and in Martinsburg, the Union garrisons from there hadn't fled like he expected them to. So he was going to draft a very bold proposal that was going to be written out in something called Special Order Number 191 that was essentially going to split his army up into smaller factions to deal with these garrisons and really try and take them out while McClellan was moving up. And he was going to be depending on McClellan to do what McClellan did best, which was to move cautiously and move slower than molasses. All right, now as you can see, we are next to a road, so we might have a little bit of road noise for this one. But I wanted to show this wayside marker that points us to the approximate area where General Lee had his headquarters for the Army of Northern Virginia from September 6th to the 9th of 1862. And as you can see here on the sign, it says here was written the famous Lost Order Number 191 and the proclamation to the people of Maryland. So it's right in here where Robert E. Lee had one of his adjuncts, a guy by the name of Robert Chilton, draft several copies of Special Order 191. What Special Order 191 did, I mentioned that there was still a garrison at Harper's Ferry. It was going to split Lee's army up into several smaller pieces. One was going to be led by General Stonewall Jackson. He was going to be taking a giant loop around to the western part of Harper's Ferry and attack it from the west. Lafayette McLaws, I've also heard his name pronounced Lafayette McLaws. He was going to be coming in from the north on Harper's Ferry in a place called Maryland Heights. Another smaller contingent or small breakaway led by General, oh wow, that's a loud truck there, led by General John Walker. He was going to take a division and attack Harper's Ferry from the east, and then Lee was going to accompany Longstreet, taking another part of this broken up army over South Mountain. So several copies of Special Order 191 were written up to be distributed, but one copy was not going to make it to its intended destination. We've moved north from the Monocacy National Battlefield, and we're on the southern edge of Frederick right now. Well, in 1862, this area would have been all farmland, but as you might expect, there's been some urban sprawl since then. This road right here ahead of us, this is Grove Road. And in 1862, this would have been pretty much no more than an old farmland. There's a quarry that's up ahead of us now, so obviously we can't go in there. And one copy of Special Order number 191 would have made its way up here to this area and was intended for another one of the generals of the Army of Northern Virginia by the name of D.H. Hill. But that copy would never make it to Hill. As a matter of fact, it was going to stay right here in this area. So after the issuing of Special Order number 191, Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia move out of here. Now, during this whole time, McClellan really has no idea what is going on with Lee and his army. So he's cautiously moving up. And around the 12th or 13th of September, they started making their way up into this very area. And there were a couple of guys by the name of Bloss and Mitchell who were in Company F of the 27th Indiana. And they were hanging out somewhere here in this general vicinity whenever Mitchell noticed this piece of paper off in the weeds, picked it up, and noticed that there were 3 cigars wrapped inside. Now, they were probably excited about the cigars. They opened up the paper and start reading it, and they see names like Jackson and Longstreet and Jeb Stuart, names that would have been very familiar to them. And they realized that they had something very important, and it was what is now known as the Lost Order. Well, this makes it up the way to the chain of command, all the way to McClellan. And this is paraphrasing, but he says, you know, with this, I will have something that if I can't beat Bobby Lee, I would be willing to go home. And this was going to completely change the whole tenor of the Antietam campaign. Okay, we've got a lot more coming from Antietam. We're going to be going to South Mountain and then to the battlefield itself. We have some people who are going to be joining us along the way that I think that you will recognize and be pretty excited about. I know that I am, anyway. But for now, we're going to make our way down the road to the next place.